Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see you today. And actually, I can't see most of you, but you can, I hope, can see me and see the screen. So today we're going to spend about an hour talking about getting your message across and reaching your stakeholders from best practices and communication standpoint. You know, of course, Paula Ropaleski. She was just talking with you. Paula is with Leading Age, and we thank her for all she's done to work with us getting this series to fruition. My partner, Paula Otto, will be joining you for the next two parts of this series, and I believe she's on today. But what we want to talk about are ways that you can actually increase your communication capabilities for your community stakeholders. And we also want to present information about how you can foster relationships with media and do a really good job to get media coverage and media messages out in a positive way, as well as perhaps deal with situations when you have to be on camera that are both ones you asked for and maybe ones you didn't ask for. As we all have known in today's COVID crisis, this is a little bit of an issue. But today we're going to talk about the fact that communication skills are critical. One of the things that is important is to really understand what you need to do to be a good, strong communicator. And in order to do that, what I'd like to do is share with you some information that came from the Center for Creative Leadership. For those of you that are familiar with CCL, they're one of the premier leadership organizations in the world. They do a lot of training, and this comes out of their leadership portal. Strong communicators, as you can see on the left-hand side, have a number of traits. They're clear and articulate, they know how to listen, they can communicate verbally and in writing, and they also understand how to link their communication to the organization's goals and plans. They are people who tend to be authentic and connected, and they are people that others listen to. If you look at the other behaviors associated with communicating, it's important that as we go through this, you begin to assess whether or not you are a strong communicator. And hopefully what happens by being a strong communicator is that you will be able to take the information we present today and take some lessons from it and move ahead. However, if you don't think you are a strong communicator, in addition to taking lessons from today, what you may want to think about is, how do I create a development plan that will help me become the communicator I want to become, both for my benefit and that of my community, staff, and other stakeholders? How do you know if you're not a strong communicator? Well, take a look at this list. You don't listen well. You don't think about who your audience is. People aren't really sure what you're asking them to do. And these last two are really big ones in the CCRC and senior services communities. You avoid conflict or might be shy. Many of you know that I also teach the Mid-Manager series, and about 80% of the people who go through that program are what we call people who are high in the personality trait of PACE. These are people who don't like conflict and who have to learn how to deal with it. So as you think about this, and as we go through here, think about how you are going to take these messages, apply them, and what skills you need in order to be able to become, again, the communicator you want to be. Now, being the communicator you want to be takes work. I have been a CFO, I've been a COO, I've been a partner in major professional services firms, including a Big Four accounting firm. What I would tell you is that in all of those jobs, somewhere between 20% and 30% of my time has been spent on communications. Now, interestingly, some of that is impromptu, some of it is unplanned. It's a normal part of your day to have to interact with a lot of people. But what I will also tell you is that planned communications are more effective and produce better results. And communications need to be intentional to have the greatest impact. Intentional doesn't necessarily mean that they're written or that they're done to a large audience. You can have intentional communications with an individual, but you need to think about what you want to say and who you want to say it to get the optimum results from your communication. Today, we're going to talk about determining and framing messages as part of your communication. And we're also going to talk about how you can set a communication plan. There's 3 parts to that: the messages, the stakeholders, and the channels. And we'll cover each one of those. Now, we've already said that communications take work. What is different now from 10 years or 20 or 30 years ago is that communications today are also 24/7. It's not just the news cycle. Everything that's out there on social media is available for someone to serve themselves at any given point in time. And you have to think about the fact that today, ad hoc communications can also be recorded on a phone or a device and distributed again 24/7. So a critical part of your thinking would be, what are business communications and what percentage of my time do I spend on them? And how much time do I really think about communications planning? What do I mean when I say communications planning? Well, first of all, it's thinking about the messages and identifying what you want to say and refining how the message goes out. Now, interestingly, as you think about that, you have to develop both the message and the process for delivering them that are appropriate to different audiences inside and outside of your community. Sometimes we're trying to create buy-in for employees. Other times we're trying to create pull, such as with market messages. Excuse me, we need the market to know who we are and what we stand for. In either case, it's important to identify vehicles and channels for each audience. One of the ways that I like to do that is to actually think about something called a communications map. Okay, what does it look like? It can look like a lot of different things. And in fact, it might have multiple pages or overlays to the map. But just like a geographical map, it tells you where your messages are supposed to go and the directions that you're going to use to get them there, and make some decisions on how your messages will travel. One way that I like to start with this is to actually think about creating a network map prior to doing the communications map. In a network map, you actually lay out the different parts of your network or stakeholders that you actually want to reach, and you write down what category they are, and then you list the key people you need to communicate or groups of people that you need to communicate with in that network map. It's very enlightening if you go through and you realize that you have lots of contacts in one part of your network or one part of the map where you need to be communicating, and virtually none in others. It helps you begin to think through where you need to strengthen your contacts, strengthen your outreach, and actually begin to think about where do you need to spend time to build your network going forward. You can also use the framework that we're going to show on the next page to look at key considerations for communications. Now, interestingly, for those of you that actually do communications for a living, you probably do a lot of this in your head. Even if you don't, you are probably making some decisions in your head, but not thinking about others. You can think about these elements in a linear fashion, or you can select them as needed as you go through your planning. But this construct is one that if I were going to take any slides out of this deck and have available to me to use as tools, this is one of the slides that I would actually print out and retain. So let's look at it. The first three chevrons stand for elements of the message. The what, the why you're doing it, and what's the outcome you want. Now, interestingly, even though the outcome is listed as the third bucket, in many ways, it's probably the most important thing that you actually need to focus on as you plan your communications. There are different types of communications. Some of them are strictly informational. Others, you're trying to drive action. Others, you're trying to implement change. You've got to think through all of that, because what words you use and how you frame your messages vary based on the outcome. They also vary based on who you're talking to and how your message is going to be delivered. So first, let's talk about the message. What are you trying to say? The reality is that messages work best when they're customized to the situation. You say, well, that's a lot of work. Yeah, it is. But it's a lot less work than doing the messaging and then find out that it doesn't stick. Think about what the purpose of the message is. Is it broadcast? Is it a high-level message that you're trying to send to a lot of people? Or is it something, excuse me, that is a segment message targeted to a specific subset of the population? You can also have targeted messages tailored to individuals or small groups. The reality is that you, as the deliverer of the message, are both in control of the message, but you also have the responsibility of making it work. And a good metaphor for that is to think about communications as a bridge. You really need to think about your audience first. What do you want? What are the results that you're trying to drive? And who am I speaking to? And then once I understand that, how do I tailor my style, channel, and words to drive to meet those folks at the other side of the bridge? Now, interestingly, this is complicated by the fact that we actually have 5 generations in the workforce today. Take a look. It's changed. The baby boomers were the dominant generation for many, many, many years. However, starting in about 2010, they began to be overtaken by the millennials. And today, as the baby boomers are retiring, the traditionalists are almost all gone. You've still got baby boomers, but you've got basically the X, Ys, and Zs, Ys being the millennials, coming into the workforce in much larger numbers. The reality is that each of these generations hears a message differently. There's a really interesting set of videos, I'm not even sure they're around anymore, called Who You Are Now is What You Were Then. What you have to think about as you, as you look at this is your audience age will make a big difference in how they hear the message because the context is different. If you think, for example, about the difference between the residents in your community who today are 100 and how they view the world versus the workers who are in high school, you'll begin to see the challenge of understanding how the different generations actually will listen to your messages. What research shows is that this is in large part based on what were the defining events that happened to them as they were growing up. The maturist and even some of the early baby boomers were affected by the end of the the end of the World War II, and also by the threat of nuclear power, and also by the Depression. All of those things tainted how they look at the world. Tainted, tilted, whatever word you want to use. It's not necessarily a negative, but it does impact that. That's very different from Gen X, who came along as the baby boomers were throwing off authority, as they were changing the way we viewed our institutions. And it is different yet again from the Ys and the Zs who dealt with 9/11, who dealt with now the COVID crisis, and who have dealt with 2 recessions in 08-09 and what the induced recession has done most recently. So you have to begin to step back and realize that broadcast or segment messages are likely going to be heard by people with different ways of listening. And it means you've got to think about how each one of them will hear it. You also need to understand that they are going to get their messages in different ways if you follow their preferences. For example, many of today's younger folks don't use email. Email is still, for most companies, a standard way of communication. Paula Ropolowski and I have dealt with this a lot with the mid-managers. You may or may not be aware that we send them an email with a link in it to take a leadership profile instrument. We've had people that we've had to contact 10 or 12 times, including having their supervisors contact them because they don't read their emails. And even after we tell them that they need to get the email link, they still don't do it. Contrast that with people like myself who use the cell phone as a key way to make sure that I'm keeping up with email and trying to respond to it on a timely basis. Text has really, for many groups, replaced email as the preferred messaging. But does your communication system actually capture texts? Do you have broadcast text capabilities? It becomes complicated when you think through how people hear, how they receive, and what their preferences are as you begin to look at the generations. You also need to think about, as you are planning your communications, how many times you're going to deliver the message. Now let's talk about this. The title of the slide is Coordination Increases Power, and it does. However, you as the leader get message fatigue. What does that mean? Well, by the time you deliver these messages and you begin to send things out and you say, these are the messages we want to send out, you're already tired of it. You've talked about it at the leadership table. You've drafted an email, maybe a Twitter feed. You've thought about posting it on Facebook. You're trying to get these messages out. However, what you have to realize is, for many people, they're only going to see it once, and they're only going to see it through one channel. So when you think about trying to get the power out of messages and getting multiple people to share the same message, it requires coordination across the segments, the groups, the age categories, all of those things that we just talked about. A good example of this are some of the key messages that were put out around the COVID-19 crisis by Leading Age. On the next slide, I have put two of the messages that they sent out. Why did they do this? Well, what they wanted was they wanted a lot of you all picking up these message points and sending them out to the public audiences as well as the internal audiences. They wanted it going to the workers, to the legislators, to the board members, to the residents, et cetera, et cetera. And so they sent these talking points out with the hope that you would pick them up and pass them on. And I suspect many of you have. Why do you do this? Well, one is to reach more people, but you also need to realize that repetition of messages increases the power of the messages. Again, you get message fatigue, but what you have to remember is that we don't retain messages very well. And I thought I had some information on the next slide. Retention, for those of you that may or may not be aware of it, you will retain less than 25% of what I've said to you within 24 hours. You might retain 50% of what you see or write. So if I hear something repeatedly, it's going to get stuck in my brain. One of the best practices that I'll point out to you sometimes, you always want to say, well, I want you to remember our mission statement to your staff. Put the mission statement on top of meeting agendas. Put it at the top of communication memos. Why? Because that retention will increase, or the repetition will increase the power of the messages. Paula Ropoleski, I'm going to stop because we are getting ready to move into stakeholders and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask at this point. Okay, then we'll move on. Stakeholders. Stakeholders is who your audience is. And we've already talked a little bit about trying to understand who they are and how they're listening to our messages. Sending messages to stakeholders requires thinking about the context in which they're going to hear it. We've already talked about the age context. But it also matters who they are in terms of positioning in relationship to you, the message, and the organization. And you can have stakeholders both inside and outside of your organization, and stakeholder maps can vary by message. Let's talk about that for a minute. Who's outside your organization? Regulators for one, legislators for another. But what about families? Families of your residents are critical. Adult children are one of the key referral sources that you have for bringing in new residents. Again, outside your organization. The level of detail and the framing of the message is different for those groups than it would be for those inside your organization, for example, to your staff and your board. Why is this hard? It's hard because they have to be consistent but tailored. So, for example, you don't want a different message about COVID going out to the public versus what's happening inside with your staff. If they think you're not being authentic and transparent, you can actually have someone go off message by disclosing that lack of congruity that they see. So this is a really important concept that you need to think about as you prepare and send messages around. I want you to take a minute and make a listing of the stakeholders that you have to think about when you do your communications. When you write the list down, it's pretty long, isn't it? It's almost a little bit overwhelming, but it's important. Understanding who's going to hear your message, we've already said, impacts the content and design, who says it, and the venues, and the frequency of communication. Now let's talk for a minute about tailoring to the audience. I have sat on about 7 or 8 not-for-profit boards. Good governance requires really good communication. Good governance also means respecting the role of both the board and management. So what types of communications should go to your board? Big picture ones. What your board needs to know is what are the issues and opportunities that you're struggling with. And they need to know about things that are a threat or an opportunity for the entity. Remember what their job is. They are, in a nonprofit organization, the people who are most responsible for the ongoing existence of the organization. They set the mission, help drive the vision, and they hire and fire the CEO. They don't hire and fire others. That's a management job. And so what you want to do is figure out how do you walk the line to share information at the board level that they need to exercise their fiduciary duty without taking them down into the minutia of management. That's an extremely different conversation than the conversation you have with line staff. What they really want to know, the line staff, is what does it mean to me? What's the day-to-day impact? Customers or clients or residents, whatever the appropriate word is for your particular situation, they want to know the same. It's a much more individualized message. So thinking through how you tailor to the audience is really important. And again, being consistent with those messages is key as well. Another thing that you have to think about when you are tailoring your communications is, how are people going to hear me based on their style? What does that mean? Well, for those of you that have taken the ProScan, you know that all of us have different ways of communicating. And it's driven by our highest trait: dominance, extroversion, pace, or conformity. This chart will mean more to those of you that have taken the ProScan than it will to others, but I think if you read it, even those of you that haven't taken the ProScan can actually get some good information out of this. Think about it for a minute. People who really care about people and who like to be part of the team are high in extroversion. They love to talk. They like a lot of airtime. They're the ones who are going to speak optimistically and inspire and motivate. And the problem when you're talking with them is they want time to talk too. That's very different from those of us who are high in pace, who listen to a message. It's the first time we've heard it. We want to go away and think about it. We don't necessarily have to say something immediately. And so as you begin to think about styles, and especially if you're writing a broadcast message, you need to think about, how am I going to appeal to all these same styles at the same time? Well, let's talk about that. Let's look at dominance. The attention span of most people with dominance, very high dominance, is pretty short. Somewhere between 30 seconds and 180 seconds. If you don't hook them after that, they're not coming back. You need to give them a direct communication that's going to tell them how to win, how they're going to meet their goals. That happens to be the first group you need to hook. The second group you need to hook is the high extroversion group. They're really concerned about being part of the team. And you need to explain to them that this message does, yes, apply to you and you're part of the team, and we want you engaged and we invite you to be part of what we're talking about. Now, what about those poor people with pace and conformity? They've been sitting there listening as you speak to the high dominance and high extroversion people. Well, guess what? They're patient. And those pace people, they're sitting there listening, trying to figure out what you're asking them about or talking to them about. And what they really want to know is, okay, what does this mean? And I'm going to go away and think about it. The conformity people are the ones who want to do it right. They are the people that are going to sit there till the bitter end, until you've told them how they can be successful and do things right based on the message you're communicating. So as you begin to pull this apart and you begin to think about segments and how to tailor messages, you can see it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. It's who, it's how, it's what age are they, it's what segment are they, it's how do I put it in context. And last but not least, you have to think about, are they a receptive and willing audience? Many audiences are very friendly and are going to be willing to give you the time and energy that you need for them to hear your message. But others are going to be resistors. And one of the things that you need to think about as you design communications is you need to think about, how am I going to deal with that? There are a couple ways to think about that. As you think about it, you ought to sit down and say, why is somebody not going to like what I'm going to say? And then how am I going to actually respond to them when they raise those issues? Now, there's a really big decision, two sides to the same coin that you're going to have to think about as you think about how to deal with resistors. Sometimes you will deal with resistors by bringing up the resistance issue and addressing it in your communications. How many times have you watched somebody stand up in front of you, give a presentation and say, I know some of you don't like what I'm saying, but let me tell you why you should. Or let me run through your objections and tell you how we're going to deal with those. Very valid. In other cases, you may want them to bring it up. You may actually want to have the resistor be forced to own the issue and bring it up in front of everyone. Or you may have a situation where you need to actually deal with the resistors in private. I was on a board where we had an issue that we were dealing with, and we had a very, very dedicated group of resistors to a couple of things that we were trying to do. And we met with them, we talked with them, we explained things, and we knew that once we made our final decision on a process that took about a year, we knew that we were going to have a small group that was a problem. And we had a lot of debate about what to do. I happened to be the board chair at that time. And we ultimately decided that what we would do is not share our decision prior to the large meeting where we were going to communicate this decision to a number of stakeholder groups. And the reason was we didn't want the resistors to organize and disrupt what we were trying to do prior to the presentation of the information. We also knew from information that we had gathered in meeting with different stakeholder groups that the vast majority of people that we had in our stakeholder groups were very supportive of the decision we had made. So we met, spoke, presented the information, and of course, the resistors brought up their issue. What was interesting was that some of the other stakeholder groups who were very supportive of where we were going actually said to this group, you haven't given this idea a chance. The board's looked at it, you need to step back and think about what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it, because it's being done for the right reasons. So we got through the meeting, and we had also at that point realized that this group was going to want their say. So we had prearranged for a small meeting with the resistors after the big meeting. And we had people who were delivering that message to the small group. There were going to be 5 or 6 of the board members and 5 or 6 of the resistors, and we were coming together. And so right after the meeting, we went around and we invited them to join us in a meeting in 20 minutes and gave them the location of the meeting. Now, at this point, having been through this issue, I was really pretty mad. I was angry. I was upset. I was frustrated because it had taken so long and these resistors were so intense. And I had originally thought about writing them a letter that I would be able to send to them and document out in writing everything that I wanted to say. And so I sat down and I wrote out this letter. It was 3 pages long. And I sent it to the CEO and said, I'm thinking about sending this letter. I actually knew before I sent it to the CEO that it probably wasn't a good idea. But the CEO read it and said, yeah, it's probably not a good idea. But what was interesting is when we got into the meeting, all of the issues that I knew were coming out came out. And because I had taken the time to write the letter, I actually had all the words in my head, and I had gone through the process that I call head-to-mouth conversion. What's head-to-mouth conversion? Well, how many of us think we have a brilliant idea or a brilliant message, and then as soon as we open our mouth and say it, it doesn't sound so brilliant? If you've sat it ahead and vetted it and thought through the words, it's important. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about that concept in the context of resistors. But I want you to come back here and realize that you actually need to spend that time and thoughtfulness thinking about all of the people that are in your audience and how you're going to deliver the messages to them. That is why communications takes, if it's done right, a lot of times 20 to 30% of an executive's time. Okay, let's move on. Well, first of all, let me stop again. Paula, are there any questions at this point?
There are none.
Okay, we'll keep going. Channels. Here's my 25 and 50%. Channels are important. Channels can be in person, in writing, in video. How you send a message impacts its retention. And anymore, the majority of channels are impacted by technology. Here's a problem. We talked earlier about the different generations. Just as people have different ways of hearing messages, their technology preferences change. And by the way, we are now at a point where the technology generations are changing every 18 to 24 months, and some people say it's 12 months. Think about it. How many of us grew up with TikTok, Slack, Teams, Zoom, all those things? They change. They keep getting different adoption rates and different acceptance rates by different generations. And you have to be specific as you think about channels, both with your stakeholder groups and your different generations. One of the other things that you need to think about is that it is driven to some degree by age, but it is also driven to some degree by socioeconomic circumstances. I was actually on Zoom this morning with a mid-manager class, and we were talking about the fact that there are a number of people who work in your communities that do not have broadband internet regularly accessible to them, nor do they have access to computers or tablets. They don't have the money to buy them. They may or may not have smartphones. So what you have to think about is that technology adoption is something that can be driven by multiple factors. However, we know that different age groups prefer different ways of communicating. Now, most every group will accept and like in-person communication, although again, under 35, it's a little tougher. But what you'll find is that the older someone is, the more likely they are to be comfortable with what I would call traditional forms of communication, and it moves down from there. I had a small business a number of years ago where I developed a web-based service. The developers were a small firm, 12 people, big open space, no offices, no separate offices, including the owner. And I would go down and visit them. And I would go down and meet them and talk to them. They did have a conference room because they would occasionally have somebody like me who was disruptive. And they said, you know what? You're the only client who ever's come to our place. You're the only client who ever talks to us. These kids, and I use the term kids, it is probably a little bit pejorative, but they have grown up very comfortable with these different channels, and we have to think about it. But regardless of the method, you have to define the message, figure out how much time you have to send it, how much attention span you can capture. Think about your audience's style, which you have got to adapt to. And then, last but not least, you need to validate that your message has been received. And I might also say understood. Why is that? Really critical messages that everyone needs to get You need to figure out how you're going to know if they got them, particularly if you're dealing with a crisis. You need to know whether or not they're getting the information and whether or not they can act on it. Now, we talked about a lot of things. What we haven't talked about so much is who should actually deliver messages. And what I would say to you is, it depends. There are times when there's only one obvious person to deliver a message. For those of you that might have seen Paula Otto talk on crisis communications in the webinar that we did earlier this year, the CEO has some messages that they have to deliver when there's a crisis. It's really not appropriate for them to delegate. However, if you're dealing with staff members, sometimes they say that CEO really doesn't understand who I am, and their peers can deliver a much more impactful message. So who people pay the most attention to varies, and what you want to do is actually think about that again as you put together the construct on how you're going to communicate these messages. This next slide talks about the leadership messaging cycle. Remember I said earlier you've got to repeat your messages from time to time? Well, here is how it happens. If you're introducing new material, you generally share information in a one-way transmission. But after you've educated people, you come back and communicate with them about why you're doing this. What do they think of it? How did they receive it? What are they concerned about? And then you begin to move that into how do I get them engaged to help me carry the message forward and to integrate the message into the workplace. You also will need to repeat or remind people with these messages through reinforcement of different channels, multiple times that it's going forward. And by the way, you may have to refine it and start all over again with that cycle. And you may have to start that cycle all over every time you have new people come into your community. You may have to think through, how do I do this? How do I bring people in and send messages forward that help transmit our culture? Critical way to think about what messaging means as you have staff who rotate through in a normal way through any healthy business. One way to do this is to actually create, remember I talked earlier about a communications map, a cadence map that lets you know what messages need to go out when. Now, what do I mean by that? This is an example of a cadence map that I worked with a client to develop. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But what we did was we used it to begin to really say, what are the ways we're going to communicate when, and how do we assign responsibilities for getting communications out? This particular entity was a December 31 year end. Believe it or not, we had a big discussion about whether or not the adoption of the plan by the board for the year happened before or after the end of the year. And guess what? There's no right or wrong. It's done different ways by different companies. This was a public company, and they actually determined that they wanted to deliver it after the beginning of the year because they saw some SEC concerns with some other things that they wanted to communicate. And so therefore they felt that they would deliver the adoption of the corporate goals and annual operating plan to their staff after the beginning of the year, after it had been adopted by the board, and it was going to be done in person through the CEO. What you can see here is that they also had quarterly operating updates, HR communications. We actually ended up having, I think, about 12 or 15 parts of this, which actually laid out what were all of the communications that were going to be going out. And then we mapped this into a grid that looked at how often each group of people were going to actually receive communications from corporate. The cadence does vary by situations. What I just told you in terms of general organizational communications can actually be planned ahead, usually on an annual cycle. But when you're in a crisis or you have a major event or change, it all goes out the window. Again, for example, with COVID, what most executives have told me is that their days became totally disrupted at the beginning of the crisis, because what happened, they felt they had to have messaging meetings just with senior leadership. And then senior leadership had to take those messages and cascade them out on a day-to-day basis. We're beginning to move out of that. We're beginning to move into, and I hate the pat phrase, but it is sort of the pat phrase, a new or newer normal, where communications are falling back into something that's much more measured, takes less time. But if we have a flare-up or a major change in research around how to manage this, it'll ramp back up again. Another time when you have cadence changes is when you're undergoing a major event, such as a regulator visit. What happens when your survey is occurring? You know, you're gonna ramp up or intensify communications. If it's done right, though, you're going to have been planning for it a long time, and you actually are going to have an annual calendar that looks at the things that have to happen as you prepare for that, and it relieves the burden as we get to the end of that or get ready for that visit. So what are best practices around corporate communication? To kind of summarize where we are, you need to have a planned out communication cycle. It's not a secret on how to do it. You've probably got elements of it together. But pulling it all into a single place where everybody can see it and understand it is not done in a lot of organizations. It's an exercise worth doing. You have a standard set of messages for your leadership that are discussed with your team and disseminated throughout the organization. Again, some of these stick around for a long time, your mission and vision. Others will change throughout the year. But as you adopt your strategic plan, you will have messages that will stay with you as you move along that journey. Messages change as appropriate. They change as you achieve a goal. They change as you enter a different part of the business cycle. They change with events. They change with the time of the year and holidays. Whatever those messages are, you are sending them through multiple channels that are tailored for your audience. And one thing we didn't spend a lot of time on is, to the extent you can, try to have them have a standard look and feel so that people realize when they see something that it's coming from your corporate communications staff. For you, here's also a reinforcement guide or checklist. What is it that you need to be doing? And let me make a comment here. Guess what? Some of you are doing this for the whole entity, but others of you are managing a department or managing a particular stakeholder group. This is just as important for you, and it can and should be done at that level, but it needs to be coordinated with the overall messaging that's put out at the highest levels. Again, you don't want to have conflict in your communication channels. So with that, I hope you've been able to take away at least a few pointers on how to get your message out. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Paula, I will open up the floor and turn it back to you for that.
All right, if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask or put it into the chat feature, that's fine. I'm always surprised we have such quiet participants.
I hope that means we answered all the questions instead of people are sitting there and not paying attention.
No, we actually have. Recommendations for sharing with the CEO. What do you mean by that? For sharing this information?
Well, so I'm not exactly sure. Are you referring to a particular slide? But let me talk about talking to CEOs for a minute. Talking to CEOs is challenging. Why? Well, they got a lot on their mind. And they're having to switch gears a gazillion times during the day. If you think about the role of the CEO, they're constantly thinking about what's next, how does this fit in with the whole organization? What you want to do when you're talking with CEOs, very similarly to the way when you're talking with a board, is think about what's the real message that I'm trying to deliver, but also what's the ask. One of the things that we saw this morning, for example, when we were talking with the mid-managers, we had presentations. Virtually nobody ended their presentation, and these were 2 to 3 minute presentations, so not long. Virtually nobody ended the presentations with an ask of why did you do this and what is it you want me to do? So when you go in to present to a CEO, you want to make sure that you've got a clear message. You want to make sure that you know the context in which you are discussing this with that person, and you want to know that they are not necessarily going to know as much about the topic as you do. That's another frustrating thing for people, whether they're board members or CEOs or even line supervisors. Sometimes they will have specialists that work for them that know a whole lot more about the material than they do. And so you've got to think about, how do I give them enough information to understand the issue and opportunity or problem, but not overwhelm them with detail and present something so that it moves away from that big picture realm. So hopefully that helps.
I think that was part of it. I think there's a little bit more in that if the CEO is not a great communicator, how do you get them to be a better communicator?
Ah, okay. Well, if your CEO is not a big communicator, they need to practice. Let me say that public speaking in particular is, I would tell you, of all the things we cover with the mid-managers, and this is not just with Leading Age Virginia mid-managers, I do a lot of coaching with executives and managers in other companies. Most people hate public speaking, and they're not very good at it. And they don't spend the time to actually think through what they're going to say. You need to encourage them to practice their communications. Now, you can help them. It was interesting. Many years ago when I was at KPMG, I took a leadership class, and we had, this will tell you how long ago it was, but Reagan was no longer in office, but we were talking about communication as our particular topic for that day. And the guy who was there was Ronald Reagan's press secretary. And he had also worked in the transition into the, I forget if it was the Bush White House, but it was another person that came in on the Republican side. And and of course, Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator. And as his press secretary, he used to only have to give him key words or key thoughts, and Reagan would take it away, and he could speak to it. When he started working with this new person, the new president said, "You see this list of notes and ideas? This is not the way to help me. I'm not good at this. I need you to write down complete thoughts and what it is I need to do, and I need your help in scripting." And so if you have a message that you need a CEO to deliver, you want them to deliver it in their own words, but it's really important sometimes for you to give them the key communication points that they ought to be considering so that they know how to actually deliver the message. But practice is going to be the main thing. And there's training available. I know Paula Otto has done a lot of training with executives. I've done some, but they've got to learn how to do it. And the only way they're going to really get good at it is practice.
Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. Paula Otto. I would say, especially if you have a CEO who could use some practice, you probably want to help arrange for some one-on-one, because given their position in the organization, they probably are not going to be comfortable, and it wouldn't be appropriate for them to necessarily be in a group setting. So that, that we could certainly help you with that, or maybe recommend somebody locally. But I think when you get to that level, it needs to be pretty personal and pretty private, that kind of coaching. Now we've got another question that the other Paula is probably going to read if we have time, from Rich.
Sure, I think it's a great question. Besides just considering the different age groups, how do you communicate with different cultural groups? Since many of our communities are highly diversified.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, Rich, that what you have to do in dealing with diverse cultural groups is the same thing that we talked about with the generational groups. There are cultural norms as to what's accepted and not accepted. So, for example, with Asian cultures, there's a much greater respect for authority than there is in the US culture. And thinking through how you're going to navigate that can be tricky. Again, what you have to figure out is, what do you want your overall culture to be? And what are you trying to do in terms of your communication culture internally? And then how to set that into context. You have to tailor those messages to those groups. And culture, by the way, is not always ethnicity. It's not always race or gender. It can be socioeconomic. It can be other groups as well. And so you've got to think about how to tailor to that.
And I would just add too, Rich, that, it's always a good idea to ask those people who you want to make certain you're communicating with accurately for their feedback. And if you could, put together a couple of folks who are representative of the various groups that you're concerned that you're communicating with appropriately, they might be able to help you. So you might be able to learn directly from them. And if you ask them to preview some communications for you, in all of the years that I was at the lottery, one of the things that we used to always say is, we're writing all of these directions for lottery players, but none of us who work at the lottery can play the lottery. And so we began to put together a focus group of players so that they could help us test our messages. So if you can get a couple of folks who you can help be your test group or your focus group, that might help as well.
I think that's it. Thank you both.
Well, we're over time. Thanks to the audience, and thank you, Paula.
I look forward to seeing you all next time. We're going to go external and talk about getting your message out through the media, and look forward to that conversation in 2 weeks.